If you're still deciding on your spring break getaway, Amtrak's got just the ticket. You can visit cities from D.C. and Philly to New York and Boston, all while enjoying more sustainable travel. Amtrak produces up to 83% less carbon emissions than traveling by car or plane. And did we mention the extra legroom and comfy seats? Book early and save at Amtrak.com. Click or tap the banner. Emissions comparisons vary depending on route and locomotive type. Restrictions may apply.
The legends are true! Overwhelming power!
The sauce of destiny!
Yes! The most legendary sauce has arrived as McDonald's transforms into the anime world of WickDonald's! The greatest flavors unite in all-new savory chili McDonald's sauce to make your 10-piece Wick Nuggets, fries, and Sprite ultra-powerful! Unlock manga comics with every meal and sit down for a new anime short every week only at WickDonald's! Ba-da-ba-ba-ba, go!
At participating McDonald's for a limited time while supplies last.
Today, healthier is happening at CVS Health in more ways than you've ever seen. It's wellness destinations for seniors, including select locations with Oak Street Health and CVS Pharmacy. It's doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and everyone in between, offering quality care and support virtually, in person, and on the phone. It's in-home evaluations through Signify Health and meeting mental health needs through Aetna. And those are just a few of the ways healthier is happening. To see more, visit cvshealth.com/healthier happens together. CVS Pharmacy, Oak Street Health, CVS Specialty, Signify Health, and Aetna are part of CVS Health. Eligibility and services vary by location and individual.
Ah, ces Anglais, ce sont des hommes courageux.
Ah, these English. They are men of undoubted courage, but they know only how to get themselves killed. They have had big tents in the beginning of the siege and still don't know how to put them up. They haven't even learned how to build a little ditch around the tents to stop the rain and wind from getting in. They eat badly, either they receive 2 or 3 times the rations of our troops. They have no resilience and cannot deal with misfortune or privations.
The war in Crimea had been going for less than 2 months, but already both sides were in dire straits. The words of a French captain as he watched the struggles of the British could have equally been applied to the Russians. In the port of Sevastopol, home of Russia's Black Sea Fleet and target of the British and French campaign, conditions were desperate for the defenders. And up on the surrounding heights, where the besieging armies camped in the open, things were even worse. Nobody had planned for a winter campaign, yet here it was. Something had to give. Following the inconclusive outcome of the Battle of Balaclava, the Russians were determined to attack again. One more huge push, throwing everything they had into the pot. Break the Allies and give them no choice but to give up the siege with winter fast approaching. The Russian plan was to storm Mount Inkerman, haul their artillery up there, and then the entire Allied army would be open to their guns. The siege would be broken. Lord Raglan, the British commander, had been warned on several occasions that his defences at Inkerman were too weak. He chose to ignore them. Possibly he'd no choice. His army was exhausted, men dropping like flies from illness and disease. Raglan's ragged divisions were already thinly spread. The last thing the British needed, barely a week on from Balaclava, was another Russian attack. Yet early on the morning of 5th November, a force of 35,000 men crossed the Chernaya River, aimed at the weakest point in the British line. A simultaneous attack on the Sapoon Heights was supposed to tie up the French and prevent them coming to the aid of the British forces, as happened at Balaclava. It was a cold, foggy morning. The fog so thick it reduced visibility to yards. At first, this aided the Russians, covering their initial assault and reducing the advantage the Minié rifle gave the British. If they couldn't see what to fire at, the volleys that had so ruthlessly checked previous Russian attacks, most famously by the Highlanders of the Thin Red Line at Balaclava, could not be used. The Tsar had ordered that every Briton and every Frenchman should be driven back into the sea by the end of the year. His soldiers attacked in wave after wave as the Battle of Inkerman developed, in the words of the Times war correspondent William Russell, into the bloodiest struggle ever witnessed since war cursed the earth. This is Wars That Shaped the World.
Слава Україні!
Bloody fog! Where are they? Where are they?
The British were taken by surprise and fell back. But now the fog came to the defenders' rescue. General Pennyfather, commanding the British defence, rushed as many men as he could muster to the forward line and ordered them to open a rapid fire, even if they couldn't see clearly what they were firing at. The British were outnumbered 6-1, but the Russians couldn't see that, and the rate of fire convinced them there were far more redcoats than in reality. General Soimenov, leading the Russian first wave, was shot down, and in a matter of minutes, first one, then another of his replacements was killed. On the right of the British line, the Russian superiority was 10-1. Here, the fog helped the outnumbered British. The battle became a series of mini-battles, fought in isolation, and the British junior officers and sergeants were far superior in leading their men than the Russians. The fighting was bitter and bloody, in particular around the sandbag battery. Defending the battery was Private Edward Hyde.
Directly, we saw their heads above the parapet. We fired at them or bayoneted them as fast as we could. We came on like ants. No sooner was one knocked backwards and another clambered over the dead bodies to take its place, all yelling and shouting. We were not quiet, you may be sure. And what with the cheering and shouting, the thud of blows, the clash of bayonets and swords, the ping of the bullets, the whistling of the shells, the foggy atmosphere and the smell of powder and blood. The scene inside the battery where we were was beyond the power of man to imagine or describe.
The fighting was hand-to-hand up and down the slopes, fog gathering in, then lifting, and all the time the rain poured down. It was life or death. Men stabbed and kicked and punched and even bit. Yet again, panic gripped one Russian regiment who fled the field. The British were boosted by the arrival of French reinforcements, the Zouaves, North African mountain troops who'd played such a key part in victory at the Battle of Alma at the outset of the campaign. On and on it went, bloodier and ever more desperate. The British were running low on ammunition.
Have you not got your bayonet?
Roared General Cathcart. He drew his sword and led a charge. His body was found after the battle with a bullet wound to the head and 3 bayonet wounds to the body. A shell exploded among Lord Raglan's staff, watching from a hilltop. General Strangeway's leg was left hanging by a shred of flesh and cloth.
Will anyone be kind enough to lift me off my horse?
He said, voice level. He was lifted down to die. At the sandbag battery, the Duke of Cambridge and the guards were down to 100 men. The Duke decided they must stand to the last man, but his aides talked him out of it. It would have been a disaster to lose the Queen's cousin and the Guards' colours. The British were still outnumbered 4-1 when the French reinforcements and British heavy artillery finally made it up to the ridge. It was the turning point. The Russians had had enough. They turned and fled. Some Allied units set off in pursuit. A dozen French soldiers even made it into Sevastopol itself. But there was no concerted Allied counterattack. The British were in no condition to mount one. The Battle of Inkerman only lasted 4 hours, yet the casualty rates were horrendous, on a level with those suffered on the killing fields of the Somme in the First World War. The British had lost 2,610 men, the French 1,726, the Russians 12,000. The slopes were littered with the dead and dying.
Right, one more. Cover him in soil, and him too. Here we go. Come on, lads, chins up. Eh? Aye. The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. He makes me lie in pastures green. He leads me by the still, still waters. His goodness restores my soul. And I will trust in you alone. And I will trust in you alone. For your endless mercy follows me.
Nicholas Wood, a war correspondent, described the scene.
Some had their heads taken off at the neck, as if with an axe. Others their legs gone from the hips. Others their arms, and others again who were hit in the chest or stomach were literally as smashed as if they had been crushed in a machine. Across the path, side by side, lay 5 Russians, who were all killed by one round shot as they advanced to charge. They lay on their faces in the same attitude, with their muskets tightly grasped in both hands, and all had the same grim, painful frown on their faces.
It was an Allied victory, but few saw it as a cause for celebration.
We have nothing to rejoice over and almost everything to deplore in the Battle of Inkerman. We have defeated the enemy indeed, but we have not advanced one step nearer towards the city of Sevastopol. We have abashed, humiliated an enemy in strong numbers, in fanaticism, and in dogged, resolute courage. But we have suffered a fearful loss, and we are not in a position to part with one man. England must give us men.
Your goodness will lead me home. Well sung, lads. Well sung. Yeah.
William Russell's words in the Times were having a damning effect, damming up the flow of men to the front who wanted to volunteer for such a war, and damning the conduct of the war by the military and the government. Russell also wrote of the neglect and indifference of those in command. Defences were not properly prepared, he suggested, and this had cost the lives of too many of their men. So weakened were the British, no new attack could be mounted until the spring of 1855, which meant winter in Russia for an army ill-equipped to deal with it.
When the cold weather comes on, hundreds must fall victims to overexertion and sickness. Sometimes not one night rest do the men get in 6, and oftentimes are 24 hours on. It must be remembered that they have only a thin blanket, and the cold and damp are very severe at night.
De Lacy Evans, one of the rare successes among the generals, urged Lord Raglan to end the siege. The Duke of Cambridge demanded the men be taken off the heights, as they would not survive winter in such exposed conditions. Raglan refused, and both men resigned. Raglan's refusal was, according to Orlando Figes, the acclaimed historian and Russian specialist, a criminal decision. On the Russian side too, there were calls to abandon Sevastopol, led by the Russian commander himself, Prince Menshikov. The Tsar refused. "We have God on our side," said Nicholas. He'd lost faith in his commanders, but he still had 2 he could rely on, Generals January and February.
Flexibility is great. That's why there's yoga. Flexibility for your insurance coverage is great too. That's why there's United Healthcare Insurance Plans. Underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, United Healthcare Insurance Plans offer flexible, budget-friendly coverage for medical, vision, dental, and more. One of these plans may be right for you if you're, say, between jobs, coming off your parents' plan, turning a side hustle into a full hustle, or even missed open enrollment. Want more flexibility? Find out more about United Healthcare Insurance Plans at uh1.com.
Elevate every morning with Tommy John's Second Skin underwear. The luxurious support of Second Skin guarantees everything will go smoothly. With over 20 million pairs sold and thousands of 5-star reviews, guys love Tommy John. Plus, your most valuable assets are covered with Tommy John's best pair you'll ever wear or its free guarantee. Get 20% off your first order at TommyJohn.com/Spotify. Save 20% at TommyJohn.com/Spotify. See site for details.
This episode is brought to you by Visit Williamsburg. In Williamsburg, Virginia, there's never too much of a good thing. Whether you're a foodie, a golfer, a history buff, a shopaholic, an outdoor enthusiast, or a thrill seeker, you'll find what you came for here and more. So ask yourself, what is it you want? Discover Williamsburg and plan your trip at visitwilliamsburg.com.
Winter arrived early in the Crimea, via a hurricane on 14th November, 9 days after the Battle of Inkerman. It wrecked the Allied camp, tearing down tents and shelters, scattering precious possessions, and was followed at once by heavy snow. Down in Balaclava Harbour and out in the bay, more than 20 British ships were sunk by the storm. One sunk with 10 million rounds of ammunition for the Minié rifles that had played such a vital part in every Allied success. The steamship Prince went down with 144 of its 150-strong crew. Its cargo was 40,000 winter uniforms for the men on the heights. Many of the British soldiers were dressed in tattered summer uniforms, sleeping in tents that leaked and had nothing to cover the ground. The Light Brigade complained men had to sleep leaning against their tent poles. While higher-ranked officers could find their own accommodation, Lord Cardigan, William Russell noted in the Times, was still bedding down on his yacht in Balaclava Harbour. For the men, the conditions were dire, as recorded by Lieutenant Colonel Sterling of the Highland Brigade.
I found sad misery among the men. They have next to no fuel. They're entitled to rations of charcoal, but have no means of drawing it, and their numbers are so reduced they cannot spare men enough to bring it 7 miles from Balaclava. The consequence is they cannot dry their stockings or shoes. They come in from the trenches with frostbitten toes, swelled feet and chilblains. Their shoes freeze and they cannot even put them on. Those who still, in spite of their misery, continue to do their duty often go into the trenches without their shoes, or they cut away the heels to get them on. If this goes on, the trenches must be abandoned. I hear of men on their knees crying with pain.
Letters were published in the newspapers underlining the horrors the men were undergoing in Crimea. Again, the parallels with the First World War are striking. Except here, the public began to turn against the conduct of the war in Russia. Russell wrote of bodies floating in Balaclava Harbour, dead horses on the side of roads, wind so cold it would deprive rats of their whiskers. And if injury or illness were to get you off the front line, there was to be no relief. The hospitals were, if anything, in even worse condition. By January, the British were down to 11,000 fit men. The hospitals in Balaclava and 400 kilometres away in Scutari on the shores of the Dardanelles were little more than waiting rooms for the morgues. As early as October, the Times was reporting regularly on the appalling treatment of the wounded. Indeed, William Russell mentioned it in his report of the initial British landing in the Crimea all the way back in September, when the sun still shone. Little thought or care had been given for dealing with the wounded. By October, there were already not enough surgeons or even bandages. There were no nurses, unlike the French, who used nuns to help treat their casualties. The French treatment of wounded was better from start to finish. Unlike the British, they had soldiers trained in first aid. The British wounded were packed onto ships, lying on open decks, often without even a blanket to cover them, and shipped to Scutari, because Lord Raglan wanted the wounded out of the way. Many died en route. The British approach to treating the wounded is perhaps best summed up by their suspicion of using anaesthetic. It is, declared the principal medical officer, much better to hear a man bawl lustily than to see him sink silently into the grave. In London, the superintendent of the Hospital for Invalid Gentlewomen contacted her friend Sidney Herbert, Secretary of State for War, and offered to lead a team of nurses to Scutari. Herbert had had the same idea, and their letters crossed in the post. Florence Nightingale was 34, one of 2 daughters of a wealthy Derbyshire family. Described as an intellectual hurricane, at the age of 17 she claimed God had called her to nursing. Herbert appointed her superintendent of the female nursing establishment of the English General Hospitals in Turkey, but not Crimea. The army didn't want a woman anywhere near the front line. But Nightingale was a forceful character. She began by recruiting young women from lower classes because she believed they'd work harder than the hundreds of middle-class volunteers, whom Nightingale believed were less manageable. She and 38 nurses arrived in Scutari in November 1854. The British hospital was overcrowded. The dying, diseased, wounded were all mixed together, lying on mattresses or blankets on a feces-stained floor. There was little water and no heating. No sooner had Nightingale arrived than so did the wounded from Inkerman. Men were dying at a rate of 50 to 60 a day. Once dead, they were sewn into their blanket and added to a mass grave. Nightingale's approach was not radical. Hygiene was the key. Hygiene and hard work.
Clean. And rinse those. Excellent. Now these.
A number of the nurses couldn't cope with her demands, or the hellish conditions in which they worked long hours, and took to drink. Nightingale sent them home.
Remove and replace the bandages. That bed, and that bed.
The hospital at Scutari was reorganised. New boilers were installed. She hired Turkish laundresses and oversaw rigorous cleaning of the wards. Nightingale herself worked 20-hour days and then did rounds late at night with the famous lamp, bought in a Constantinople market. It was the Times who first recorded her as the lady with the lamp.
Be still. Rest.
A ministering angel, without an exaggeration in these hospitals, and her slender form slides quietly along each corridor. Every poor fellow's face softens with the sight of her. When all the medical officers have retired from the night, and silence and darkness have settled on miles of prostrate sick, she may be observed alone, with a little lamp in her hand, making her solitary rounds.
Your wounds are improving.
But despite her Herculean efforts, the death rate at Scutari continued to rise. By February 1855, it stood at over 50%. It was only after a government commission found the hospital had been built over a cesspool and sewage was leaking into the drinking water that the death rate was checked. There was one nurse who made it to the British front line. Mary Seacole, daughter of a Jamaican mother and Scots father, had nursed in British military stations in Jamaica, but was turned down for Nightingale's group, quite possibly because of her colour. Nevertheless, she set out for Crimea with Thomas Day, a relative of her late husband. In Constantinople, they stopped to collect supplies, where Seacole is thought to have met with Nightingale. There she also recruited a young Greek Jew, who Seacole was to call Jew Johnny. The three of them built the British Hotel in Crimea, a restaurant and general store which became popular with British officers. The 50-year-old Seacole was often to be found tending to wounded soldiers during attacks or barrages, as noticed by William Russell of the Times.
She doctors and cures all manner of men with extraordinary success. She is always in attendance near the battlefield to aid the wounded, and has earned many a poor fellow's blessing.
Russell was an experienced reporter, having cut his teeth covering Irish elections at the age of 21. He would wait in the hospitals rather than the polling stations, as it was there, he figured, the stories would be found. Now in his 30s, he did not hold back in his attacks on the Allied command, and Lord Raglan despised him for it, forbidding any of his staff from talking to the man from the Times. But that didn't stop Russell. as one officer described.
A vulgar, low Irishman who sings a good song, drinks anyone's brandy and water and smokes as many cigars as a jolly good fellow. He is just the sort of chap to get information, particularly out of youngsters.
It was said even the Tsar in St. Petersburg read his reports. Russell's words and those of his colleagues in the Crimea were having an impact back home. This was the first war where public opinion began to matter. Funds were raised to help the soldiers struggling through the winter. The women of Britain, including Queen Victoria and her ladies-in-waiting, knitted winter woolies for the boys in Crimea. The end of the newspaper stamp duty in 1855 meant more and more papers sprung up, and more space was given to letters from the front describing what was going on in every gory detail. Previously, newspapers had relied on paying army officers or diplomats for war coverage and received little more than censored military reports. Now the new war correspondents provided eyewitness reports of the British Army's struggles, and crucially, there was no censorship. The steamship and expansion of the telegraph network across Europe allowed reports to get home much more quickly. Photography was another first. Pictures from a war zone began to appear for the first time. They were often staged and couldn't capture movement. But shots such as James Robertson's photograph of cannonballs strewn across the Valley of the Shadow of Death had a huge impact, even if Robertson had rolled more cannonballs into the shot. The wider public felt engaged with the war like never before, and letters flooded into the papers. Readers wanted a say on the war. After all, it was their sons dying on the battlefield and in the hospitals. The government feared the press. Roger Fenton, a royal photographer, was sent to take more positive pictures. The art of political media spin was already alive. Raglan complained that Russell's reports were helping the Russians and appealed to the Duke of Newcastle, the new Secretary of State for War, to do something about it. The Duke wrote to editors and warned reporters, but it had no effect. 2 days before Christmas, the Times published a scathing editorial attacking Raglan for his handling of the Crimean campaign. It effectively accused him of putting family before country, as 5 of his aides-de-camp were nephews. A furious Raglan accused Russell of treason.
I ask you to consider whether the paid agent of the Emperor of Russia could better serve his master than does the correspondent of the paper that had the largest circulation in Europe.
But at home, Newcastle was feeling the heat. He had to answer the calls for change and pressed Raglan to sack his quartermaster and adjutant general. Raglan refused. Instead, Lord Lucan was sent home, but too late to save the government. In January 1855, amid mounting pressure from the press, the House of Commons voted for an investigation into the condition of the army. It was the final straw for the beleaguered Prime Minister, and the following day, Lord Aberdeen resigned.
After a sharp frost, it snowed all day and there was a very cold wind. Such a melancholy, dreary day. Alas, we saw in the morning papers that the government had been beaten by 157. Mr. Gladstone made a most brilliant speech, but a more reckless act has never been committed. Albert truly compared it to the Spaniards, who had murdered their generals after a defeat. We waited in anxious expectation for Lord Aberdeen, but got a short walk before seeing him. When I took leave of good, kind Lord Aberdeen and shook hands with him, he said, "My heart is very full. I was a good deal upset afterwards, and could hardly quite pull myself round for the children's pretty little German play, which took place at 5:45.
Queen Victoria called on the 70-year-old Lord Palmerston to step into 10 Downing Street. Britain and its army remained a country for old men. The Allies were fortunate that the Russians were in an even greater mess. Generals January and February, as the Tsar liked to call them, had done their bit, but he had no confidence in his flesh and blood generals. As conditions within Sevastopol became ever more desperate, in St. Petersburg, the Tsar sunk into a depression. He became unwell, but insisted, one particularly cold February day, in inspecting troops without a coat on. The temperature was minus 23. The Tsar developed full-blown pneumonia, and on 2nd of March 1855, Nicholas I, Tsar of all the Russias, died. In less than 6 months, the Crimean War had brought down a government and killed a Tsar. As news of his death reached the West, stocks rose on the exchanges in London and Paris. Nicholas was seen as a warmonger. His death cheered in Britain and France. In Windsor, the Queen provided a considered view.
Poor Emperor. He has, alas, the blood of many thousands on his conscience. But he was once a great man, and he had his great qualities. What he did was from a mistaken, obstinate notion of what was right, and of what he thought he had the right to do. What the consequences of his death may be, no one can pretend to foresee.
His successor, his 36-year-old son Alexander II, knew Russia could not stay at war much longer, but he was determined not to surrender. His idea was to keep on fighting and try to drive a wedge between France, where there was growing pressure to end the war, and Britain. Palmerston was keen to widen the conflict. He believed Russia must be destroyed as a military force, and he had the support of the country. The public protests had been about how the war was being waged, not against war itself.
Let us get as many German and Swiss as we can. Let us get men from Halifax. Let us enlist Italians, for Christ's sake. The thing must be done. We must have troops.
Early in 1855, the Austrians staged initial peace talks in Vienna, but the British persuaded a wavering Napoleon that war must go on. It would, declared Lord Cowley, the British ambassador in Paris, be a humiliation for France to leave the war without taking Sevastopol and destroying the Black Sea Fleet. Cowley's words hit home, and in April, Napoleon arrived at Windsor Castle for a council of war. Napoleon and Palmerston came up with 3 options for attacking elsewhere in the Crimea, and sent the plans to Lord Raglan to decide which one to execute. Raglan ignored them. The French were furious. They were on to their 3rd commander in Crimea after Canrobert resigned. His replacement, General Pélissier, was regarded as a man of action. But around Sevastopol, nothing changed. The Russians had improved the port's defences, including building underground bunkers where men sheltered in relative comfort, compared to the British soldiers shivering in their bare trenches in the hills. The British and French turned to drink. Alcohol consumption was a feature of the campaign. The Russians had a mug of vodka for breakfast. It was wine for the French and rum for the British.
Almost every regiment has a canteen, and at the door of these stood, no, they did not stand, for very few could, but lay and rolled about in groups of French and English soldiers in every state of intoxication. Merry, crying, dancing, fighting, sentimental, singing, quarrelsome and dead drunk. French just as bad as English, English just as bad as French. Let him be English, French, Turk, Sardinian. Give him enough money and he will get drunk.
As winter wore on, British officers struggled to maintain discipline. More than 5,500 men were court-martialed for acts of drunkenness. But spring was arriving. Blooming flowers covered the ground, there was birdsong above the trenches, and best of all, supplies improved. Alexis Soyer, the French head chef of the Reform Club in London, favourite haunt of ministers, was sent to improve food for the troops. He arrived in Balaclava with Florence Nightingale. Soyer soon improved the food for the wounded. Then he turned his attention to the fit, and for the first time in its history, introduced the idea of collective cooking to the British Army. Previously, rations were doled out to individuals who were left to get on with it. The chef invented the portable Soyer stove, which remained in use in the British Army for the best part of a century, set up army bakeries to produce a flatbread that lasted months, and trained a soldier cook in each regiment. But his greatest success was in making army rations palatable, notably with soup recipes for large numbers of men.
Pour 5.5 camp kettles into the boiler. Add 50 pounds of meat. We have beef or mutton usually. Then add all you have of the ration of vegetables for 50 men. This is a recipe for 50 men. I would like 10 small tablespoonfuls of salt added, and we leave it. We leave it to simmer for 3 hours. And then eat. Bon appétit, mes soldats. Bon appétit, mes soldats.
If an army marches on its stomach, then the British were ready to move again. Spring was here. Sevastopol lay below them. It was time for the final assault. Next on Wars That Shaped the World.
The Russians mounted the parapets of the Redden and delivered volley after volley into us. They hoisted a large black flag and defied us to come on. The cry of murder could be heard on that field, for the cowardly enemy fired for hours upon our countrymen as they lay writhing in agony and blood. As some of our officers said, "This will never do. We'll pay them for this yet."
Wars That Shaped the World was a Goalhanger Podcasts production. It was produced by Holy Smokes. This series was written by Robin Scott Elliot and narrated by Paul Waggott. The producer was Neil Fearn. The executive producer was Tony Pastor.
Holy Smokes.